London, 1842. There are moments in a woman's life that pass quietly, and then there are moments that reshape her forever. Anne Fairley would remember this day not because of what she said, but because of what she stopped saying afterward. She had always been called impulsive. It was the word her family used most often, usually spoken with a polite sigh, as though her very nature were an inconvenience they had long grown tired of managing. Impulsive, they said, as if curiosity were a flaw, as if a quick mind were something to be corrected, but no one ever dared to say aloud what Anne truly possessed: courage. She was a sweet young lady by all appearances, soft-featured, graceful in movement, gentle in manner, yet her thoughts ran faster than society allowed. Anne listened closely to conversations meant only for men: politics, trade, philosophy, the subtle power plays hidden beneath polite smiles. And when something intrigued her, she spoke. That, according to her family, was her greatest sin. "A proper lady listens," her mother reminded her endlessly. "She does not speak," her aunt added, lips tight with disapproval. "And she certainly does not comment," her older cousins whispered, half mocking, half warning. From an early age, Anne was taught that a woman's voice was dangerous, that words, once released, could ruin her chances of marriage. That intelligence, when paired with honesty, was not charming, it was threatening. Still, Anne tried. She tried to soften her tone. She tried to measure her words. She tried to stay silent when her thoughts begged to be heard. But silence never came naturally to her, and that was why, on that particular evening, her family decided she needed to be taught a lesson. The ballroom of the Harrington estate glittered with chandeliers and whispered ambition. Silk skirts brushed marble floors. Gentle laughter floated beneath orchestral music. London society had gathered in full force. Dukes, duchesses, ladies, gentlemen, all perfectly arranged in their roles. Anne stood among them, pale blue gown carefully chosen to appear modest. Her hands were folded, her posture flawless, her voice restrained. She had promised herself she would say nothing unnecessary. Yet when a group of gentlemen began discussing recent developments in Parliament, careless assumptions, shallow observations, Anne felt that familiar spark stir within her chest. Without thinking, without malice, she offered a gentle correction. Just one sentence. Polite, informed, calm. The silence that followed was immediate. Her mother turned first, eyes sharp as glass. Her aunt's fan snapped shut. Her cousin let out a laugh far too loud to be kind. "Oh, Anne," her mother said, smiling sweetly, the kind of smile that cuts deeper than cruelty ever could. Always so eager to display opinions no one requested. A ripple of uncomfortable amusement spread through the room. Anne felt her cheeks warm, but she did not lower her gaze. "Not yet. I merely thought," she began. "That," her aunt interrupted smoothly, "is precisely the problem." Her mother stepped closer, placing a gloved hand on Anne's arm, firm enough to command attention. "Allow this to be a lesson," she announced, her voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. "A young lady who cannot control her tongue will never control her future." Laughter followed. Polite, controlled, merciless. Anne stood frozen as her family continued, not raising their voices, not causing a scene, but dismantling her with practiced precision. They spoke of her as though she were not standing there, as though she were an object being evaluated, corrected, displayed, a warning. Anne felt it then, the moment something inside her folded inward. The spark that made her expressive, the curiosity that once lit her eyes, the confidence that had always lived just beneath her gentleness. It dimmed. She lowered her gaze, her shoulders softened, and for the first time in her life, Anne Fairley learned how to disappear without leaving the room. She did not cry, she did not argue, she did not flee, she simply became quiet. That should have been the end of it. But in that same ballroom, amid the music, the gossip, the carefully curated cruelty, someone had been watching, not with amusement, not with judgment, but with growing disbelief. He had noticed her earlier, the way she listened, the way her mind worked faster than her lips could restrain. He had admired her composure, her intellect, her refusal to pretend ignorance for the comfort of others. And when her family humiliated her publicly, he could not remain silent. The Duke of Ravensmere stepped forward. The shift in the room was immediate. Conversations hushed. Fans paused mid-motion. Heads turned. A duke did not interrupt lightly. "Forgive me," he said calmly, his voice firm without being raised. "But I must object." Anne's breath caught. Her family stiffened. "To what, Your Grace?" her mother asked, still smiling, though now the edges trembled. "To the assumption," the Duke replied, eyes unwavering, "that intelligence in a woman is something to be corrected rather than cultivated." The room held its breath. "I have listened carefully," he continued, "and I found Miss Fairley's observation not only appropriate, but accurate." Anne felt the impact before she fully understood it. Someone had seen her, not as an embarrassment, not as a problem, but as a mind worth defending. "I would hate," the Duke added coolly, "to live in a society where courage is mistaken for impropriety." Silence followed, heavy, undeniable. Anne did not look up. She was afraid that if she did, this moment might vanish, but it did not. Because when a woman who has been taught to silence herself is finally seen and truly heard, the world does not simply return to how it was. That evening ended quietly. Too quietly. Anne returned home with her family, her humiliation wrapped neatly in polite conversation and forced normalcy. No one spoke of the Duke's defense. No one acknowledged the shift that had occurred. But Anne felt it. Something had been broken, and something else had been awakened. She retreated inward after that night. Her words grew fewer, her presence smaller. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then, carefully. Her family believed the lesson had worked. They were wrong, because days later the Duke of Ravensmere arrived at their door, and what he asked for would change Anne's life forever, but Anne did not know that yet. All she knew was this. Her voice had vanished, but someone, somewhere, believed it was worth restoring. And that quiet belief was the most dangerous hope of all. The knock came on a morning when the sky looked undecided. Pale light behind heavy clouds, as if even the day itself could not decide whether to be gentle or cruel. Anne heard it from upstairs, not the knock itself, not exactly, but the change it caused. Footsteps halted, a maid startled in hail, her mother's voice sharpening into that polite tone she used when she suspected opportunity. Anne paused mid-button of her sleeve, fingers suddenly numb. After the ballroom, she had learned the art of being invisible. It was exhausting, but it kept her safe. It kept her from becoming the family's entertainment again. It kept her from being punished for having thoughts. So when she heard her aunt whisper, "A carriage with a crest," Anne felt her stomach tighten. A visitor of rank, and then her cousin's voice, too excited to be subtle, floated up the staircase. "Oh, it's a duke." Anne's breath stilled. A duke. Her mind betrayed her with one single image. The ballroom chandeliers, the music, the moment her family had turned her into a lesson, and a man stepping forward like a blade drawn from its sheath. The Duke of Ravensmere. Anne told herself it could be another duke, but she already knew. Downstairs, the air changed into ceremony. Her mother ordered the parlour prepared as if a royal inspection were coming. Her aunt adjusted the flower arrangement with frantic devotion. Even the servants moved differently, careful, alert, as though the whole house had suddenly grown ears. Anne remained at the top of the staircase, half hidden behind the carved banister, unseen. She watched. The front door opened, And there he was. The Duke of Ravensmere did not enter as men like him often did, with arrogance, with an expectation of worship. He entered with a quiet certainty that made everyone else feel slightly unbalanced, tall, composed, dressed in dark tailoring so perfectly cut it looked effortless. His presence carried that subtle authority that did not need volume to command. He removed his gloves slowly, as though the timing of every gesture mattered. Anne's mother curtsied too deeply. "Your Grace," she said, voice honeyed, "what an unexpected honor." The Duke's gaze moved across the room with calm assessment, not unkind, but precise, like a man accustomed to seeing what others tried desperately to hide. "I appreciate your welcome," he said evenly. "I won't pretend my visit is social." Anne's aunt gave a brittle laugh. "Oh, of course not. A man of your importance. I'm here," the Duke interrupted, not raising his voice, "because of your daughter." Anne's mother's smile widened so sharply it almost looked painful. "My daughter," she echoed, as if she had several and couldn't possibly guess which he meant. "How intriguing!" Anne's heart pounded so loudly she was sure someone would hear it upstairs. The Duke's gaze shifted, not to her mother, not to her aunt, but to the staircase, to the shadow, to Anne, and stepped back instinctively, like a startled animal. But it was too late. He had seen her. The Duke did not smile. Not yet, but something in his expression softened, the way a flame does when the wind stops fighting it. "Miss Fairley," he said, and somehow her name sounded different in his mouth. Not a burden, not a flaw, a person. Anne's throat tightened. Her mother turned sharply, realizing for the first time that her daughter was there. "Anne," she called with forced sweetness, "come down. Don't be rude." Anne descended slowly, each step feeling like a decision she wasn't sure she deserved to make. In the parlour, she curtsied properly, perfect posture, controlled breath, eyes down. "Your Grace," she murmured. The Duke waited a moment, then spoke calmly. "I owe you an apology." Anne's head lifted before she could stop herself. "My apology," she repeated, surprised into honesty. Her mother's eyes flashed warning. The Duke's mouth twitched, not a full smile, but the beginning of one. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, "not only when you were humiliated." Anne's fingers clenched into her skirt. "No one usually speaks at all," she said softly, the truth slipping out before caution could grab it. A faint, amused breath escaped him, not mockery, recognition. "I noticed," he replied. Her mother cleared her throat loudly, as if to remind the entire room who controlled Anne's existence. "Your Grace," she said, "if you came to discuss the unfortunate incident at Harrington—" "I came," the Duke cut in smoothly, "to discuss Miss Fairley's future." The word future landed in the room like a dropped glass. Her mother's face brightened. Her aunt's expression became greedy in disguise. Anne felt cold. Because in her world, a woman's future was always another word for ownership, marriage, reputation, control. "I've come with an offer," the Duke continued, "a proposition." Anne's mother leaned forward, practically glowing. How generous. The Duke's gaze remained fixed on Anne, as though he were deliberately refusing to let her become invisible again. "I would like to take Miss Fairley into my household." Silence. Anne blinked. Her mother's face froze, then recovered quickly, too quickly. "Into your household?" her mother repeated, confusion masked as politeness. "Yes," the Duke said, "to my estate, under my family's guidance." Her aunt stiffened. "Your Grace, that is highly unusual." "I'm aware," the Duke replied. Anne's mind spun. She could not understand why. Why would a duke, a man with wealth, influence, power, care about a girl who had been publicly dismissed as a social failure? Her mother tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "Your Grace," she said, "Anne is spirited, as you witnessed, hardly refined." The Duke's eyes didn't flicker. "That," he said, "is precisely why I'm here." Anne's pulse throbbed in her ears. Her mother's mouth tightened. "Spirited girls do not fare well in society." "I agree," the Duke replied. "Not when their own families punish them for breathing." Anne's mother stiffened, as though he had slapped her with a silk glove. Her aunt let out a shocked gasp. The Duke continued calmly, voice smooth, controlled, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "You have treated her courage as a flaw," he said. "You have mistaken her mind for rebellion, but I see a diamond that has been struck until it learned to dim." Anne's throat tightened painfully. A diamond. The words should have made her feel precious. Instead, they made her feel exposed. The Duke's gaze softened again, but his voice remained firm. "My mother," he added, "has long believed that intelligence should be nurtured, regardless of gender. She has agreed to help Miss Fairley refine her voice, not silence it." Anne's eyes stung. Refine her voice, not silence it. But then her fear rose again, sharp as a needle. "What would you want in return?" Anne asked before she could stop herself. Her mother inhaled sharply, scandalized. A woman did not question a duke, but Anne had always had one terrible habit: truth. The Duke looked at her for a long moment, and when he answered, his honesty was just as dangerous as hers. "I want you," he said simply, "to have a chance to become yourself again." The room felt too small for those words. Anne's mother regained her voice first, trying to steer the conversation back into her control. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "Anne is not a companion nor a governess. She is a young lady," the Duke finished, "who deserves safety." Her mother's smile returned, brittle and strategic. "And what would society say?" The Duke's mouth curved slightly. "Society," he replied, "will say what I instruct it to say." Anne's heart jolted. It wasn't arrogance. It was power used as protection. For a moment, Anne imagined it, leaving this house, leaving the constant correction, leaving the fear of her own thoughts. It was such a bright fantasy that she almost didn't trust it. Her mother's eyes narrowed. And how long would this arrangement last? The Duke turned his gaze back to Anne, as if the answer mattered only to her. "As long as she wishes," he said. Anne's breath caught. "As long as she wishes." No one had ever offered her a choice. Her mother's hand tightened around her teacup. Anne could feel her family calculating, the prestige of a duke's attention, the advantage of connection, the possibility of future favor. They would accept, not because they cared, because they would benefit. Anne's stomach turned. She looked at the Duke, truly looked. He was not smiling like a charming gentleman. He wasn't offering flattery. He wasn't dazzling her with sweet promises. He looked sincere and terrifyingly patient, as though he understood she had been trained to distrust kindness. Anne's mother spoke again, syrupy and swift. "Of course," she said, "we would never stand in the way of Anne's opportunity." Anne's chest tightened. Opportunity, like she was a commodity being traded. The Duke's eyes cooled slightly. "I would like," he said, "to hear Miss Fairley's answer." The room froze. Her mother's smile faltered. Her aunt's eyes widened. Her cousin looked offended. Anne's heartbeat hammered. They expected her to obey. They expected her to accept because it was a duke. They expected her to smile and pretend gratitude, but Anne could barely speak at all anymore. Her voice had been punished out of her. She stared at the Duke, searching his face for deceit. She found none, only a quiet steadiness, like a hand extended across a storm. Anne swallowed. And for the first time since the ballroom, she tried to speak with her own will. "Shh!" Her voice came out thin. The Duke waited, completely still, as if her words were worth all the time in the world. Anne's mother's gaze burned. Anne's fear screamed, "Don't! Don't say the wrong thing, but somewhere beneath the fear, something else stirred, a tiny, stubborn spark, a remembrance of who she had been. Anne lifted her chin a fraction. "I don't know if I can be fixed," she whispered. The Duke's voice was low, careful. "I'm not asking to fix you," he said. "I'm asking you to come where no one will break you again." Anne's eyes stung. Her mother opened her mouth to interrupt, but Anne did something shocking. She spoke anyway. "What if I disappoint you?" she asked. The Duke's expression softened fully now. "Then," he said, "I will be disappointed in myself for ever expecting you to perform." Anne felt something in her chest crack open. Not pain. Something else. Hope. But hope, for a woman like Anne, was frightening. Because hope could be taken away. Anne looked around the parlour. At her family's perfect faces, their controlled smiles, their silent demands. Then she looked back at the Duke, and she realized the true question was not whether she trusted him. It was whether she dared to trust herself again. Anne took a shaky breath. "Yes," she whispered. Her mother's smile snapped back into place like a mask being forced on. "Wonderful," her mother said quickly. "We accept your grace." Anne blinked. "We accept." The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. "No," he said, calm but unmistakably firm. "She accepts." Anne's breath hitched. Her mother's smile trembled. The Duke turned back to Anne. "You will leave tomorrow," he said softly, "if you still wish it." Anne swallowed hard. Tomorrow, so soon, so real. She nodded because words might fail her. The Duke bowed, the gesture respectful, not ownership, not conquest. A promise. Then, before he left, he spoke one final sentence, quiet enough that only Anne could truly feel it. "They tried to teach you that your voice is a threat," he murmured. "But, Miss Fairley, your voice is a light, and I intend to see it burn again." Anne's eyes filled, and as he walked away, her family already whispering behind her, Anne realized something else. The Duke was offering her refuge, but refuge came with its own dangers, because a woman who begins to heal often learns truths that others desperately want buried, and somewhere in London's glittering world, beneath the polite smiles and ballroom music, Anne could already sense it. This was not only a rescue, it was the beginning of a scandal. The carriage moved through the city as though London itself were holding its breath. Anne sat inside, hands folded tightly in her lap, the rhythm of the wheels beneath her doing nothing to steady the storm inside her chest. Every street they passed felt like a farewell, to familiarity, to fear, to the version of herself that had learned how to survive by shrinking. She did not look back. She was afraid that if she did, courage would abandon her entirely. Across from her sat the Duke of Ravensmere. He did not speak, not because he was distant, but because he understood something most men did not. Silence, when chosen, could be gentle. Anne noticed small things instead, the way he held himself without stiffness, the way his attention never felt invasive, even when he watched her, the way his presence filled the space without pressing against her. It unsettled her. At her family's house, silence had always been punishment. Here, it felt like permission. When the carriage finally slowed, Anne's heart began to race again. She pressed her fingers together, grounding herself in sensation. The estate gates opened. Ravensmere House rose before her, not ostentatious, not cold, but vast in a way that felt intentional rather than intimidating. Stone warmed by age, tall windows catching the soft light of the afternoon. Ivy climbing as if the house itself had decided to live. Anne swallowed. "This is my home," the Duke said quietly. "Not your new prison, not where you must learn to behave, just home." The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. Anne hesitated. The Duke did not rush her. When she finally stepped down, her foot touched the gravel, and with it, Something inside her shifted. No voices corrected her posture, no eyes sharpened in judgment. No whispered warnings followed her movement. The house waited. Inside, the air was warm and calm, light filtered through tall windows. Paintings lined the walls, not portraits of rigid ancestors, but landscapes, bookshelves, moments captured rather than claimed. Anne felt suddenly exposed, not because she was being watched, because she wasn't. A woman entered the hall, posture dignified but expression kind. Her silver hair was styled neatly, her gaze sharp with intelligence rather than expectation. "This," the Duke said, turning to Anne, "is my mother." The Duchess of Ravensmere smiled, not politely, genuinely. "So," she said, studying Anne with open curiosity, "this is the young lady who caused a ballroom to forget how to breathe." Anne's eyes widened in horror. I didn't mean—" The Duchess laughed, a warm, unrestrained sound. "Oh, my dear," she said, waving a hand, "if you had meant it, I would admire you even more." Anne froze. The Duke cleared his throat, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Mother," he warned mildly. "What?" the Duchess replied innocently. "I'm behaving." Anne looked between them, unsure. The Duchess stepped closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "You are quite safe here," she said. "No one in this house believes that silence is a virtue." Anne's throat tightened. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she trusted her voice enough to respond. The Duchess straightened. "You'll be tired," she continued. "A room has been prepared. You may rest, read, stare dramatically out a window, all noble pursuits." Anne let out a startled breath that might almost have been a laugh. The Duke glanced at her, surprised and pleased. A maid led Anne upstairs. The room she was shown into was simple but beautiful, soft colours, a desk by the window, books already arranged on a shelf, not decorative but clearly read. Anne traced a finger along the spine of one. History, philosophy, poetry. No one had asked her what she liked. They had simply assumed she was allowed to like something. That night, Anne barely slept. Not because she was afraid, but because her mind would not stop asking dangerous questions. What if this kindness has limits? What if I fail again? What if my voice returns and they regret it? The next morning, Anne dressed carefully, choosing modesty over confidence. Old habits clung tightly. She descended the staircase quietly, too quietly. The Duke was already in the breakfast room, reading. "Good morning," he said without looking up. Anne paused. She waited. He did not add correction, did not instruct her posture, did not evaluate her tone. He simply waited. "Good morning," she replied, testing the words like a fragile object. He looked up then, not scrutinizing, just attentive. "I hope you slept," he said. "I didn't," she admitted, before caution stopped her. The Duke smiled faintly. "Neither did I," he said. "New beginnings have that effect." Anne hesitated. Then, softly, "Do you expect anything of me?" The Duke set his book aside. "Yes," he said. Her chest tightened. "I expect honesty," he continued, "and patience, mostly from myself." She blinked. "That's all." "For now." Anne nodded, unsure what to do with such freedom. Breakfast passed gently. The Duchess joined them, asking Anne questions that were not tests, only curiosities. What she enjoyed reading, what made her laugh, what topics interested her. When Anne hesitated too long, the Duchess leaned closer. "You may take your time," she said kindly. "Thoughts are allowed to stretch here." Something loosened in Anne's chest. Later, the Duke walked with her through the gardens. "Society," he said carefully, "will have opinions." Anne almost laughed. "That is generous," she replied. He smiled openly now. "They will whisper, they will speculate. Some will invent scandal where there is none." Anne's courage wavered. I don't wish to ruin your reputation." The Duke stopped walking. He turned to her fully. "Anne," he said quietly, "my reputation has survived wars, politics, and my mother's dinner parties. I assure you, it can survive the presence of an intelligent woman." Despite herself, Anne laughed. It slipped out before fear could stop it. And the sound of it, her laughter, startled her. The Duke looked at her as though he'd witnessed something rare. "There," he said softly. "That." She frowned slightly. "What? That is the beginning of your return." Anne felt warmth creep into her cheeks, but beneath the warmth, fear lingered, because returning meant risking pain again. That evening, Anne stood at her window, watching dusk settle over the estate. She was safe, but safety did not erase scars, and somewhere in London, beyond the walls of Ravensmere House, whispers were already beginning. Dearest reader, it has come to my attention that when a young lady disappears from her family's grasp and reappears under a duke's protection, society rarely assumes kindness. Speculation, after all, is London's favourite pastime. Yet one must wonder, is this a tale of rescue, or the start of something far more dangerous? I, for one, would be quite curious to hear what you think. If you wish, leave your thoughts below. I would dearly love to read your opinion. That night, Anne lay awake again, but this time the fear was different because she was no longer afraid of being silent. She was afraid of learning how to speak again and whether love, real love, might be waiting for her voice to return. Anne discovered something unsettling on her third day at Ravensmere House. Conversation could be dangerous. Not the sharp, weaponized conversation she had grown used to, the kind that corrected, humiliated, or quietly warned her to stay in her place. This was different. This was the danger of being understood. It began innocently enough. She was in the library, not hiding and merely existing. The room smelled of old paper and polished wood, a scent that felt strangely comforting. Sunlight spilled across a long table where several books lay open, their pages marked with careful notes written in a precise hand. Anne traced a finger along a margin. "You may disagree with him," a voice said behind her, "but he does make an infuriatingly clever argument." Anne startled, then relaxed when she realized it was the Duke. "I wasn't disagreeing," she said automatically, then froze. Old instinct screamed at her. "You spoke too quickly. You should apologize." But the Duke only smiled faintly. "Good," he said. "Then I won't feel compelled to defend him." She turned slowly. "You read philosophy?" she asked, then winced internally. Too forward, too curious. "Yes," he replied easily. "Badly. According to my mother, she insists I read it like a man preparing for a duel rather than reflection." Anne hesitated, then dared. "I think philosophy is a duel," she said softly. "Just a quieter one." The Duke's eyebrows lifted. "Oh," he said, "do elaborate." Anne's heart began to race. This was the moment where she usually faltered, where she would soften her words, retreat, apologize for having thoughts. She folded her hands tightly together. "I think," she began carefully, "that philosophy is where ideas fight for survival. Some are elegant, some are cruel, and the ones that win shape how we treat each other." She looked up, bracing herself. The Duke was watching her with full attention. Not indulgence, not surprise, respect. "That," he said after a moment, "is the best explanation I've heard in years." Anne felt heat rush to her face. "You're not just saying that." He tilted his head slightly. "If I were," he said, "my mother would sense the insincerity from 3 rooms away." Anne laughed, a small, startled sound, and just like that, something shifted. From that day on, conversation became their quiet rebellion. They spoke during walks through the gardens, debating books and ideas beneath ancient trees. They talked over tea, Anne slowly forgetting to measure every word. Sometimes they disagreed, and instead of punishment, she was met with curiosity. One afternoon, Anne challenged him outright. "You assume power is always corrupting," she said, pacing slightly as she spoke. "But what if power is only revealing?" The Duke leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "So," he said calmly, "you believe corruption already exists?" "I believe," Anne replied, surprising herself with her steadiness, "that power only gives people permission to be honest about who they already are." Silence followed. Anne's breath caught. Had she gone too far? Then the Duke smiled, slow, impressed. "That," he said, "is an argument I've been waiting years to lose." She stared at him. "You mean you disagree?" "I mean," he corrected, "that you may be right." The word struck her harder than praise ever could. He was not humoring her, he was learning from her, and that realization was terrifying, because admiration, once felt, rarely stayed contained. Anne noticed it first in the way his gaze lingered too long when she spoke with passion, in the way he fell silent, listening, as though the world narrowed when she explained something she loved. She noticed it when he laughed, genuinely laughed, at her dry observations. And worst of all, she noticed it when she missed him on the days they did not talk. One evening, during dinner, Anne grew animated without realizing it. She spoke of a historical figure she admired, a woman who had influenced policy without ever being officially acknowledged. She changed the course of events, Anne said, eyes bright. "And history barely remembers her name." The Duchess nodded approvingly. "And what does that tell us?" she asked. Anne didn't hesitate. "That women have always shaped the world," she said, "even when the world pretended not to notice." The Duke watched her closely. Later that night, as Anne stood by the window again, she realized something frightening. She was not only healing, she was becoming visible, and visibility had consequences. The first letter arrived the next morning, not addressed to Anne, but to the Duke. The seal was unfamiliar, the tone unmistakable, speculation. The Duke read it silently, then folded it neatly. "What is it?" Anne asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Nothing urgent," he said. Anne recognized the lie, not malicious, but protective. She did not press. But later, she overheard the Duchess speaking sharply to a visitor. "Kindness," the Duchess said coolly, "is only scandalous to those who profit from cruelty." Anne's chest tightened. She had known this piece would attract attention. London did not trust quiet happiness. That afternoon, Anne found the Duke in the study, staring out the window. "They're talking," she said softly. He turned. "Yes," he replied. "They always do." She swallowed. "I don't want to be the reason." "You are not the reason," he interrupted firmly. "You are the excuse." Anne looked at him, startled. "For what?" "For their discomfort," he said, "with a woman who refuses to stay small." Something in his voice made her heart stumble. "And if they pressure you?" she asked. "If they demand explanations?" His gaze softened. "I will give them one," he said. Anne's pulse quickened. "What explanation?" He stepped closer, not invading her space, but undeniably present. "That I enjoy your company," he said simply. Her breath caught. "That I respect your mind," he continued, "and that I have no intention of sending you away simply because society prefers obedient women." Anne's chest felt tight, too tight. "Do you ever," she asked quietly, "wish I were easier?" The Duke did not hesitate. "No." The certainty in his voice frightened her more than rejection ever could. She looked away, overwhelmed, because wanting someone like this, someone who saw her fully, was dangerous. Because soon she would have to leave. Her return to her family had already been discussed, dates mentioned, arrangements whispered. The thought hollowed her chest. That night, Anne lay awake again, but this time she did not fear silence. She feared distance, and somewhere deep inside, a realization stirred. Quiet, inevitable, and terrifying. She was falling in love with a man who had never asked her to disappear. And that kind of love changes everything. Anne learned about the whispers the way women always did, not through confrontation, not through honesty, but through silence that suddenly felt heavier than usual. It began with invitations that arrived later than expected, or not at all. A pause in conversation when she entered a room with the Duke. A subtle shift in posture, a glance held just a moment too long, the kind of smile that pretended warmth while measuring consequences. London society was not loud when it disapproved. It was surgical. Anne noticed it first during a small afternoon gathering hosted by the Duchess of Ravensmere. Nothing extravagant, just tea, light conversation, and a few carefully chosen guests meant to ease Anne back into society's rhythm. She had dressed with quiet confidence, pale green silk, hair pinned simply, no attempt to dazzle. She reminded herself she was allowed to exist. At first, it went well. A lady complimented her choice of book. Another asked about her travels. A gentleman nodded respectfully when she spoke, actually listening. Anne felt a fragile hope unfurl. And then the questions changed. "So," a woman said lightly, stirring her tea, "how long will you be staying with the Duke's family?" Anne paused. I'm not certain," she replied honestly. "Oh," another voice chimed in, "how unconventional." The word landed softly, but it bit. Anne glanced instinctively toward the Duke, who was speaking with another guest. His posture remained calm, but his gaze flicked toward her, alert, protective. She straightened. "I find clarity often comes after safety," she said gently, "not before." There it was, that faint intake of breath, that tightening of lips. A woman across the table smiled thinly. "How philosophical," she said. "One might almost forget we're discussing propriety." Anne's chest tightened. She had spoken again, and once more silence followed, not the kind that protected, the kind that warned. The Duke joined them moments later, sensing the shift. "Have I missed something fascinating?" he asked pleasantly. "Oh, nothing at all," the woman replied quickly. "We were simply admiring Miss Fairley's perspective." The Duke's smile sharpened, not unkind, but unmistakably aware. "I admire it as well," he said. "Frequently." Anne's breath caught. The effect was immediate. Conversation resumed, but the warmth had vanished. That night, Anne stood alone in the gallery, staring at a painting she could no longer see. "They're sharpening their knives," she said quietly, without turning. The Duke joined her. "Yes," he replied. "They dislike uncertainty, and they dislike women who inspire it." She swallowed. "I don't want this to become a scandal." He turned to her fully. "Anne," he said softly, "it already is." Her heart dropped. "Because of me, because of us," he corrected. She looked at him then, really looked. The man who had defended her without hesitation, who listened as though her thoughts mattered, who had given her safety without demanding gratitude, and suddenly she saw something else. Conflict. He had not planned this, had not expected his sense of justice to grow into something far more personal. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. He did not answer immediately, and that pause, that small, human hesitation, frightened her more than a denial ever could. "I regret," he said finally, "that you were ever made to feel unworthy of protection." She searched his face. "That's not what I asked." He exhaled slowly. "No," he said, "I do not regret you." Her chest tightened painfully. "But he continued, honest even when it cost him, "I am beginning to understand what this will cost." Anne looked away. "So am I." Because she knew what came next. Pressure. A week later, it arrived. A formal visit, a formal tone, a formal warning. a respected family friend, influential, polished, dangerous, sat with the Duke in the study. Anne was not invited, but the walls were thin enough for implication. "You are risking misunderstanding," the man said calmly. "A duke does not invite a young lady into his household without intent." "I invited her," the Duke replied evenly, "because her family failed her. Society will not see it that way." "Society," the Duke said, voice cooling, "is not my moral compass." There was a pause. "And if they demand resolution?" Another pause. Longer this time. Anne pressed her hand to her chest, breath shallow, because she understood what resolution meant. Marriage, distance, or exile. That evening, Anne confronted him, not dramatically, not with tears, with quiet honesty. "I will leave," she said simply. He turned sharply. "No, I cannot be the reason you are cornered," she continued. "I won't let them force your hand." He stepped closer, agitation breaking through his composure. "You think leaving protects either of us?" "It protects you," she said. "From obligation." His voice lowered dangerously. "And who protects you?" She hesitated. "I am learning to," she said. The words hurt him. She could see it. "I won't ask you to choose me," Anne continued softly. "Not when the cost is your freedom." He stared at her as though she had struck him, not with cruelty, but with truth. "I never asked you to be small," he said, "and I won't ask you to be trapped," she replied. Silence stretched between them, loaded, alive. Finally, he spoke, not as a duke, not as her protector, but as a man. "You are not a burden," he said quietly. "You are not a responsibility I regret, and you are certainly not a mistake." Her throat tightened. "Then let me go before I become one." His jaw tightened. "You think distance will cure this?" "I think," she whispered, "that staying will make us both braver than society is ready to forgive." The words hung between them. Dangerous, honest, unavoidable. That night, Anne packed slowly, not because she was ordered to, but because she chose dignity over comfort. Yet as she folded her dresses, one question haunted her relentlessly. Was love supposed to feel like this? Like healing and loss and courage colliding all at once, and somewhere in London the whispers sharpened further, because society had sensed it now. This was no passing kindness. This was something far more threatening. A woman rediscovering her voice, and a duke beginning to realize he might lose the one person who had ever spoken to him without fear. Anne did not cry while she packed. She had cried enough in her life to know when tears would betray her. So she folded each dress with care, as though precision might anchor her resolve. The room that had once felt like refuge now felt like a threshold, not unkind, but final. Leaving had always been easier than staying. Staying required faith. She paused at the desk by the window. The book she had been reading lay open, her own notes written in the margins, careful at first, then bolder, more assured. Proof that she had begun to take up space again. Anne closed the book gently. Downstairs, the house moved quietly, as if aware that something important was unfolding. No one interrupted her. No one rushed her. That kindness hurt more than cruelty ever had. When she descended the stairs with her small trunk, she found the Duchess waiting. The older woman did not speak at first. She simply took Anne's hands, warm, steady, unafraid. "You are not required to leave," the Duchess said softly. Anne swallowed. "I know," she replied. "That is why I must." The Duchess studied her for a long moment. "You are choosing dignity," she said. "That is rarely the easy choice." Anne managed a faint smile. "I learned it here." The Duchess squeezed her hands. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "this house will always recognize your voice." Anne nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the carriage waited, and beside it stood the Duke, not composed, not distant, human. He looked as though he had not slept, eyes shadowed, jaw tight with restraint. "Anne," he said. She stopped a few steps away. "I will not stop you," he continued carefully. "But I will not pretend I understand this choice." She held his gaze. "I am choosing myself," she said. "The woman I am becoming cannot be protected like a secret." His chest rose slowly. "And what if I choose you?" The words struck her like thunder. "You cannot," she said, shaking her head. "Not out of obligation, not to silence gossip. I would never—" "I know," she interrupted gently. "That is why this is so difficult." He stepped closer. "You believe leaving preserves my freedom," he said. "But you are wrong." She frowned. "Without you," he continued, voice low, "I am merely a man who did the right thing once." Her breath caught. "With you," he said, "I am forced to become braver." Anne felt her resolve tremble. "You once told me," she whispered, "that my voice was a light." "It is," he replied without hesitation. "And light," she said, "draws attention, fire, consequences." He nodded. "I am prepared for them." She shook her head again, tears finally threatening. "You should not have to be." He took her hands then, not possessive, not desperate, just honest. "I have lived a life of comfort and control," he said. "And you walked into it and showed me what courage actually costs." Anne's heart ached. "You taught me to speak again," she said, "but I must learn how to stand alone." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said something unexpected. "Then allow me to stand beside you," he said. "Not in front, not above. Beside." She searched his face. "And if society demands an answer," she asked, "then I will give them the truth." Her breath hitched. "And what is that?" "That I love you," he said simply. The words settled between them. Not dramatic, not explosive. Certain. Anne's world tilted. Love, not rescue, not obligation. Choice. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. When she opened them, her voice was steady. "Then I will stay," she said, "but not as a secret, not as a compromise." His mouth curved, not triumphant, but relieved. Agreed. They stood there, hands joined, knowing full well that what they had chosen would not be forgiven easily. Inside the house, the Duchess watched from the window. And for the first time in years, she smiled like a woman who had just witnessed history shift. Because Anne Fairley was no longer running from the world, she was preparing to face it, and London, for all its whispers and judgment, had no idea what was coming next. The invitation arrived wrapped in elegance, thick paper, embossed crest, careful wording, a ballroom invitation. Anne held it between her fingers as though it might burn her. London did not invite people without intention. It summoned them. "They will expect a spectacle," Anne said quietly. The Duke stood by the window, reading the same card with a far more critical eye. "They will expect submission," he replied. "Or scandal." Anne exhaled slowly. "And if I give them neither?" He turned to her then, studying her not as a duke studies society, but as a man studies a woman he loves. "Then," he said, "they will have to listen." The night of the ball arrived, wrapped in crystal light and anticipation. The ballroom glowed, chandeliers blazing, music swelling, silk and velvet in motion. Whispers travelled faster than footsteps. Anne felt them before she heard them. That's her. The one from Ravensmere, the girl who forgot her place, the Duke's... What exactly? She stood at the edge of the room, arm lightly resting on the Duke's. Once, this room had stolen her voice. Tonight, it would not. She wore deep blue, not soft, not timid. Her hair was styled simply, her posture relaxed rather than rehearsed. She did not perform confidence, she inhabited it. As they moved forward, conversation shifted. Fans paused, smiles sharpened. A woman approached first, graceful, dangerous in her politeness. "Miss Fairley," she said sweetly, "how bold of you to attend." Anne met her gaze. "I find courage improves with practice," she replied calmly. The woman blinked. The Duke's mouth curved slightly. They did not retreat. They danced, and as the music carried them, Anne felt something remarkable. She was not being watched. She was being measured. At the end of the dance, a gentleman, older, influential, stepped forward. "Miss Fairley," he said, voice carrying just enough, "society has been curious about your arrangement." Anne felt the weight of the room press inward. This was it. The Duke shifted slightly, not to shield her, but to signal his presence. Anne lifted her chin. "There is no arrangement," she said clearly. "There is respect." A murmur rippled. "And affection," she added evenly, "given freely." Silence followed, shocked, electric. The gentleman frowned. "You speak boldly for a woman without title." Anne smiled, as not sweetly but sincerely. "I speak boldly," she said, "because I am no longer afraid of being misunderstood." The Duke spoke then, voice calm, decisive. "Miss Fairley speaks with my full regard," he said, "and my full intention. Every ear strained. I intend," he continued, "to make her my wife." The room erupted, whispers colliding, scandal blooming like wildfire. Anne's breath caught, not in fear, in awe. He had not asked the room for permission. He had claimed truth. Anne turned to him, eyes shining. "You are quite impossible," she murmured. "I am inspired," he replied softly. They stood together as the storm raged. Gossip, scandal, disbelief, and for the first time, Anne did not shrink. She had spoken. She had been heard. And London would never forget the night a woman reclaimed her voice in the very ballroom that once tried to take it away. Scandal does not knock before entering. It arrives smiling. The morning after the ballroom, Anne woke to a city already rewriting her story. Newspapers did not mention her name. They never did when a woman's reputation was being dismantled. But phrases appeared like careful blades. An ambitious young lady, a duke misled by sentiment, an arrangement disguised as affection. Anne folded the paper calmly. She had expected this. What she had not expected was how personal the attacks would become. The first visit came before noon. A lady of impeccable standing, known for her impeccable morals and selective memory, requested a private audience. Anne received her in the drawing room alone by choice. The woman smiled warmly. "My dear," she began, settling into a chair, "London admires romance, but it fears imbalance." Anne poured tea with steady hands. "And what imbalance concerns you?" she asked. The woman sighed delicately. "A woman without fortune, without title, suddenly elevated by a duke's affection. It invites misunderstanding." Anne met her gaze. "Affection is not theft," she said calmly. The woman's smile tightened. "No, but influence can be dangerous in the wrong hands." There it was. Anne leaned back slightly. "You are worried," she said gently, "that I might speak." The woman blinked. "That I might be heard," Anne continued. "And that others might realize silence was never their only option." The woman stood abruptly. "I see you have already been corrupted by confidence," she said coolly. Anne smiled. "Confidence," she replied, "is not contagious. Courage is—" The woman left without another word. By evening, the second blow arrived. A letter, sealed, anonymous, cruel in its precision. "He will grow tired of defending you." Men always do. "You will be remembered as a mistake, and he will survive it." Anne's hand trembled, not because she believed it, but because part of her had once been trained to. She found the Duke in the study, staring at documents spread across his desk, invitations withdrawn, alliances quietly threatened. "They are pressing," he said without looking up. "They want me to distance myself." Anne's throat tightened. And will you?" He looked up then, eyes steady. "No." She hesitated. "Even if it costs you," he smiled faintly. "It already has," he said, "and I am still standing." Anne crossed the room slowly. She placed the letter on the desk. "They are trying to turn me into a liability," she said softly. The Duke read it once, then tore it in half without ceremony. "They are trying to turn you into a weapon," he corrected, "against yourself." She swallowed. "I don't want to be the reason you lose allies." He stood, stepping closer. "Anne," he said quietly, "I have negotiated wars. I have lost allies before. What I will not lose is truth." Her eyes burned. "I am not fragile," she said suddenly. "I do not need to be hidden." His expression softened. "I know," he said, "but you should not have to fight alone." She took a breath, then made a decision. "Then let me stand with you," she said, publicly. He studied her. "What do you propose?" She lifted her chin. "We stop reacting," she said, "and we start defining." 2 days later, London gathered again, not in a ballroom, but in a formal luncheon hosted by the Duchess of Ravensmere herself. It was a calculated move, and everyone knew it. Anne entered beside the Duke, not as a guest, not as an apology, but as a presence. When conversation turned, as it inevitably did, toward speculation, Anne spoke. Not loudly, not defensively, clearly. "I understand there are concerns," she said calmly, "about my position, my influence, my worth." The room stilled. "I will not pretend I arrived here with power," she continued, "but I arrived with integrity, and I will not diminish myself to preserve the comfort of those who benefit from my silence." A breath passed through the room. Anne glanced briefly at the Duke, not for permission, for partnership. He nodded once. "My engagement," he said then, "is not a scandal. It is a statement." Murmurs rose. "Of respect," he continued, "of equality, and of the future I choose." Anne felt something shift, not just in the room, in herself. Later that night, alone again, Anne realized something quietly profound. Love was not only tenderness, it was alignment, and betrayal, when it came, would not come from strangers. It would come from those closest to her past, because somewhere across London, her family had been watching, and they were preparing to speak. Anne had always known this moment would come. You cannot step into the light without awakening the shadows that once owned you. The invitation arrived not with elegance, but with obligation, her family requesting a meeting, phrased as concern, wrapped in propriety, sharpened with expectation. "They want to reclaim the narrative," the Duke said quietly, reading the letter once before handing it back to her. Anne's hands did not tremble. "Then it is time," she replied, "that I tell my own." The meeting was arranged at a respectable residence, neutral ground, carefully chosen to appear civilized. Her family arrived precisely on time, expressions perfected, grievances rehearsed. Anne entered beside the Duke. She did not shrink. Her mother was the first to speak. "You have caused quite a stir," she said, lips curved in something that pretended to be a smile. "This attention is unseemly." Anne met her gaze steadily. "What you call attention," she replied calmly, "I call consequence." Her aunt scoffed softly. "You were always dramatic." Anne inhaled. "No," she said, "I was always honest. You simply preferred silence." The room tightened. Her cousin leaned forward. "You were never meant for this world," she said sharply. "You speak too much. You invite judgment." Anne nodded slowly. "Yes," she agreed. "And you taught me that was dangerous." Her mother's composure cracked. "We tried to protect you." Anne's voice did not rise. "You tried to contain me." Silence fell, heavy, unmistakable. The Duke spoke then, his voice measured but unyielding. "You humiliated her publicly," he said, "and when she survived it, you called it misbehavior." Her mother stiffened. "She embarrassed us." Anne took one step forward. "I embarrassed you," she said, "because I refused to be small." Her family stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, not compliant, not apologetic, unreachable. "I will not return," Anne continued, "not to your control, not to your fear." Her aunt laughed bitterly. "And you think a duke's affection will last?" Anne turned to her calmly. "I no longer measure my worth by permanence," she said, "only by truth." The meeting ended without reconciliation. But it ended with something far more powerful: finality. Outside, the air felt lighter. Anne exhaled a breath she had been holding her entire life. "I thought it would hurt more," she admitted softly. The Duke squeezed her hand. "Healing often does," he said. "At first." That evening, London whispered again, but the tone had shifted. Not dismissal, recognition. Dearest reader, it appears that when a young lady refuses to return to the silence that once confined her, those who benefited most from her quiet grow suddenly uncomfortable. One might almost admire the audacity. But tell me, do you believe reconciliation is owed to those who only loved obedience? If you wish, leave your thoughts below. I would truly love to read your opinion. That night, Anne stood on the balcony beside the Duke, watching London glow below. "It's over," she said quietly. "No," he replied. "It's resolved." She smiled faintly. "There is a difference." He turned to her. "You have changed everything," he said. "Not just for yourself." Anne rested her head lightly against his shoulder. "I only learned how to stop disappearing," and for the first time she believed it completely. Tomorrow, London would demand celebration. Tomorrow, there would be titles, announcements, expectations. But tonight was peace and healing, and the promise of a future chosen, not assigned. The morning Anne woke as herself felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. The city hummed beyond the windows. Life continued, indifferent to transformation, unmoved by courage. And yet, everything had changed. Anne stood before the mirror, not searching for approval, not rehearsing restraint. She saw a woman who had been broken gently, deliberately, and had chosen to heal loudly. Downstairs, the house stirred with quiet purpose. Today, London would not whisper. Today, London would listen. The announcement was not made in haste, nor in secrecy. It was issued with calm precision, invitations delivered, expectations set. The location chosen was deliberate. The same ballroom where Anne had once been humiliated. The same room. Redemption, Anne had learned, often returned us to the place of pain, not to wound again, but to reclaim it. When she entered the ballroom that evening, every eye turned, not because of spectacle, because of certainty. Anne walked beside the Duke, no longer guarded, no longer tentative. Her posture was relaxed, her expression open. She did not brace for judgment. She allowed it to come. The Duke stepped forward when the room had settled. "I once defended a woman here," he said clearly, "because injustice was easier to recognize than its consequences." A hush fell. "I did not know then," he continued, "that I was also defending myself from a life where courage was admired only from a distance." He turned to Anne. "You were told your voice was a liability," he said, "that it would cost you love, safety, belonging." Anne met his gaze, steady. "But your voice," he said, "did not destroy anything worth keeping." A breath rippled through the room. He took her hands. "Anne Fairley," he said, "you did not arrive in my life quietly. You arrived honestly, and you taught me that love is not protection without respect." Anne's eyes shone, not with tears but with recognition. "I ask you," he said, "to stand with me, not as something refined, reshaped or restrained, but as yourself." He lowered himself before her. Gasps echoed. "Will you be my duchess?" he asked, "and my equal?" The room held its breath. Anne did not rush. She thought of the girl who had been told to stay silent, of the woman who had learned to disappear, of the voice that had returned, stronger for having been taken away. "Yes," she said clearly. The word rang like a bell. Applause followed, not polite, not cautious, genuine. Anne helped him rise, laughter breaking through her composure as the Duchess embraced her tightly. Later, as the evening softened into celebration, Anne found herself alone with him for a moment, the noise distant, the city glittering beyond tall windows. "Do you realize," she said lightly, "that I once feared speaking would cost me everything?" He smiled. "And instead, it gave me everything worth having." He leaned closer. "You were never too much," he said quietly. "They were simply afraid of not being enough." Anne rested her forehead against his. "I am not impulsive," she said softly. "I am courageous." He kissed her hand. "Yes," he agreed. "You always were." That night, Anne stood once more in the ballroom, but this time she did not disappear. She danced, she laughed, she spoke, and London at last learned something it had long resisted. A woman's voice is not a scandal, it is a beginning. Anne's story is not about a duke who rescued a woman, it is about a woman who reclaimed herself. Love did not save her voice. Courage did. Love did not silence the world. Truth changed it. And healing did not come from being chosen, but from choosing to stay visible. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a wound, a hope, know this. You are not difficult. You are not excessive. You are not wrong for being heard. You are brave. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for choosing stories where women are never meant to disappear.